Surprise.
So, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here at the first lecture of our I-HILT lecture series. And the first one will be by our very own Professor of Legal History, Professor Randall Lesaffer, and he's going to talk about warmongers, disturbers of the peace, and violators of sacred trust. Randall, give you the floor.
Thanks very much, Inge. Thanks for coming. Today I'm going to present a paper which has been submitted to the European Journal of International Law and accepted, so it will be published somewhere next year. It's actually quite a long paper, as you might have seen, but it's the one with the shortest title I ever gave, because the title of the paper is Aggression Before Versailles, but I thought for today I add a few words, which are actually not a quote, I made it up. This line of terms, but these are terms that individuals come back into the sources when talking, when people are talking in the 17th, 18th century about aggression, though not necessarily in the English language, of course. When historians of international criminal law or international criminal lawyers and historians of use of force law or international lawyers specialized in the use of force among states talk about aggression and the roots of aggression, they very rarely take them back beyond the Peace Treaty of Versailles that made an end to World War I between the Allied and Associated Powers and Germany in 1919. And this, let's say, restricted interpretation of the history of, or reduced interpretation, I would say, reductive interpretation of the history of aggression, only taking back to World War I, works very well with the more, let's say, general interpretation of the history of use of force law among international lawyers and historians of international law, which is generally depicted in terms of an overturn, a revolution of the use of force law, with at the one side of that revolution the almost complete prohibition of the rights for states to resort to force in Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter of 1945. And at the beginning of that evolution, the situation of the allegedly existing situation at the end of the 19th century, of which it is said that the jus ad bellum, use of force law, was just a jus ad bellum, a recognition by international law that states had a right to resort to force and to war, and the fact, the so-called indifference theory, that international law was largely indifferent, that it didn't distinguish between legal and illegal wars, between just and unjust wars, that it just accepted the fact of the sovereign right of states to resort to war or resort to force. And the Treaty of Versailles is often seen as a first major stepping stone towards the overhauling of that right, towards the prohibition of the right to resort to force and war at the end of World War I. Okay, thanks. Why does aggression work with that in terms of the Treaty of Versailles? Well, aggression figures in three important places in the Treaty of Versailles. First, there's Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles, which is also the covenant. The first 26 articles of the Treaty of Versailles are also the covenant of the League of Nations, in which between Article 10 and 16 a collective security system is introduced, and that makes aggression, Article 10, into a concern for all members of the League of Nations. Then there are the infamous Articles 2027 and 2031. 2027, which is often referred to as the beginning of international criminal law, because it is said that William II, the German Emperor, will be arraigned before an international tribunal for the violation of international morality. That refers back to the report of the Commission on the Responsibility of the War that speaks of aggression, and the violation of treaties, which is the violation by Germany of its treaty guarantee of the neutrality of Belgium, and let's not forget Luxembourg, which were both invaded in August 1914 by Germany. And then there's of course the even more infamous so-called guilt clause of Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, where it is said that Germany and its allies are solely responsible for the war and are accountable for all costs and damages of the war. That is the implication as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. In recent years, there's been quite some scholars who have started to attack the indifference theory, both in terms of the 19th century, but also more widely have attacked the mainstream grand narrative of the evolution of use of force law, that basically says that at the end of the Middle Ages you still had the just war doctrine, that put restrictions on the right of states to resort to force and war, that just war doctrine lost its force and was faded out over the 16th, 17th, 18th century against the background of the rise of the sovereign state, that it completely then disappeared and collapsed in the 19th century, for then the revolution of the 20th century towards the prohibition of the use of force to take place. Let's say scholars have been attacking all, I would say, almost all stepping stones of this grand narrative. I've been worked myself in the past on the early modern age, and I will say some things about that. But the gist of my argument today is that first, there was indeed a right for states to resort to war and force in the 19th century, but it was not unconditional, and thus it was restricted. And there were potential violations of that right, or overextensions that were a violation of the normative system that regulated international relations at the time. Secondly, you can only really understand the state practice and the legal scholarship of the 19th century if you read it back in the tradition of the 17th, 18th century, which was still very influential. And thirdly, I claim that in 17th, 18th century and 19th century international law, if I may call it that, there was a conception of an aggravated violation of the restrictions on the right to use force and law that was inconsequentially, but with rising frequency, referred to as aggression, and that triggered a kind of right to collective action against the aggressor, and even sometimes there was talk about the punition or the punishment of that aggressor, or at least the leader of that aggressing state. In my paper, I'm going, just like in the written paper, to work now quickly through 4 parts. First, I'm going to try to explain what needs to be rehearsed about the dualist system of just and legal war in the 17th, 18th century. Then I will actually strengthen my arguments by going into the case of aggression at the beginning of the 7 Years' War of 1756 and the reaction of a leading international law author of the time, Aimé de Wattel, to that particular case. Then I will briefly look into 19th century doctrine, both in scholarship and in practice, and then we'll try to make some sense of the actual meaning of Versailles, of which I would say Versailles was indeed an innovative treaty to the extent that it actually sanctioned aggression, but it was not innovative to the extent that it actually recognized the existence of a violation of the normative system of international relations called aggression. Okay, let's first go back far in time to the 17th and 18th century. Let's mostly speak about the 18th century here, about which I would state that the normative system that organized use of force, that regulated use of force, worked with a dual, with 2 conceptions actually of war, and with 2 normative systems that both regulated, not independently from one another, but jointly, the question under what conditions a ruler, a state, could resort to force or even to war. These 2 conceptions are just and legal war. To start with the oldest one, just war. What is a just war? Under the classical just war doctrine, as it was articulated by 12th and 13th century canon lawyers and theologians, most famously so Thomas Aquinas. What is a just war under that perspective, or that perspective? A just war is a one-sided law enforcement action by a prince or a state to enforce its rights. Is an act of legal self-help after a violation of one of its rights, or after a unprovoked or illegal attack on its territory or on itself. It opposes necessarily a just belligerent to an unjust belligerent, and to that extent it is discriminating between the 2 sides. In a consequential application of the doctrine, as medieval canonists and theologians would generally make, it means that only the just side actually has a right to wage war, to use force, and the unjust side actually should not use force. It means that the benefits of waging war, the jura belli, the rights of war, such as a right to be held to ransom when making captive, to demand ransom from a captive, to plunder or to conquer, that these rights of war only benefit the just side, and that the unjust side, even in extreme interpretations, which are the mainstream interpretations, the Middle Ages, should not even defend itself, because it doesn't even have the right to use violence. At the end of a just war logically stands a just peace, and even in the writings of Wattel in the middle of the 18th century, he defines this as a peace in which the object of contention, the disputed right, should of course go to the just side, which is not necessarily the winner of the war, and that the unjust side, who is not necessarily the loser of the war, should be accountable for all the damages and costs of the war. This is of course highly impractical because in the end the laws of war rest on reciprocity. But this is not a concern to theologians and canonists because in the end they actually think of just war in terms of the question what participation in the war does to your eternal life, to your soul. How will it affect the end result of the final judgment at the end of time? But when Roman lawyers in the 13th and 14th century, civilian lawyers, who are actually concerned with the here and the now, with the temporal world, with the secular world, not with the eternal life, with enforceable rights and obligations between rulers in the here and the now, when they adopt and take over, transfer the just war doctrine from canon law into Roman law, they of course have trouble there. And this is already the beginning of a second conception of war, which Grotius would call solemn war, which Vattel would call la guerre en forme, formal war or legal war as Gentili would have it, which puts less conditions on the acceptability of a war than just war. For a war to be just, you need to be sovereign, you need to have just cause, which is a violation of right, a prior violation of right, you need to have good intent, and the use of force must be necessary and proportional to your goal, which is the restoration of your rights. For a war to be legal, you only have to be sovereign and formally declare war, as 16th century Roman lawyers as Ayala, Gentili, and also Grotius in the 17th century would say. Now, in general literature about the early modern ages, generally said, or it's often said, that legal war displaced just war in state practice, and legal war displaced just war over the 16th, 17th, 18th century, already by the end of the 17th century in scholarship. Now, this is blatantly untrue if you look at the sources. This is just not correct. In Grotius, in Vattel, in Wolff, in most of the writers of the 17th, 18th century, they actually operate the two conceptions side by side. Now, this of course seems strange to the modern lawyer, but Grotius gives us, in the clearest of ways, a key, which is not innovative because this goes back to the medieval distinction between the spiritual world, between the relationship between man and God, which is about your future in the eternal life, and the secular world, which is about the relations between men and men, or between state and state, in this case, in the here and the now, in this very short period of a few dozens of years that we live on Earth. Grotius recycles this distinction by making just war, by clearly saying that just war is part of natural law, the natural law of nations, and that legal war is part of the voluntary, or later known as the positive law of nations, which emerges from customs and treaties and actions of states, while natural law is based on ultimate inherent principles that are inherent to the human condition. Now, these are two, let's say, fields of application that actually give a different answer to a different question. What is acceptable under natural law? What is acceptable under positive law? That still doesn't make very much sense until Grotius says the one applies in the internal forum, which means in conscience, and the other one applies in the level of enforceable rights in the here and the now, in the external forum, in external relations. And then it starts to make sense, because what does it mean to the Christian believer as Grotian is? Conscience means the soul. And conscience is not just a moral principle, as it would be to many of our modern readers or listeners. Conscience here to Grotius and to most practitioners of international law diplomacy and scholars of the 17th, 18th, and even deep into the 19th century, that's the case for many, conscience also is the soul that you will carry at the end of time to the final judgment, where God then will basically judge your conscience and decide whether you go to heaven and hell. So to Grotius, the normative system of natural law is, as he many times says, the true law, quoting Cicero. It is the real law. And to the Christian believer, it is actually also very enforceable, because as Vattel still writes in the middle of the 18th century, it will be enforced by the highest court of all at the end of time. So a wise prince would actually always take care that his war is not only legal by formally declaring it, but also just, by arguing at least that it is just. But there's more to it than that. The two are also intertwined or inextricably connected to one another. Why? Simply said, any sophisticated writer from the 13th century to the 18th century who writes about this dualism says the same, in one way or another. The one is a default solution to the other. The one is a substitute solution to the other. In the impossibility for human beings, in a case between two sovereigns who both claim to be the just side, and that's the practice. In 99%, if not 100% of wars between sovereign princes in Europe, both sides take a great effort to claim that they are the just side. In this case, for human beings, it's generally impossible to know who speaks true, who objectively is the just side. It will have to be left to God to decide at the end of time. So that means that you have to assume that both sides have a right to wage war, and legal war then indeed becomes the platform for a war in which both sides are assumed to be the just side, both sides are assumed to have the right to wage war, both sides benefit equally from the rights of war, from the laws of war, we would say, from even jus in bello, we would say today. And it is impossible to base a peace on a rendering of justice, to style the peace as an act of justice. It will have to be based on victory or on the outcome of a negotiated process in the peace treaty. Yes?
May I ask a question on the 18th century? Do you also take in consideration, for instance, Zum ewigen Frieden of Kant? So it is part of a whole attention in the German Enlightenment for cosmopolitanism. Yeah. I myself have published on the header, Johann Gottfried Herder, who was very much critical of the use of force by Western countries in what we now would call the Third World. Yeah. And recently I discovered that this Zum ewigen Frieden, towards perpetual peace, is part of a whole awareness, especially in German Enlightenment, on yes, the necessity to build peace. And so it was a rediscovery, but I think I would say, but I'm a dilettante, that it is also relevant.
Yeah, I don't cover it in my paper because it was long enough as it is. It is, let's say, not central to this argument, but of course it is part of a rise of a concern about collective action and collective security. And you use the word necessity, but in a different context. It is also built up on the 19th century in German scholarship to put the argument of necessity central, not only the necessity to make peace, but also the necessity to go to war, which is of course not what Kant intended, but it's one of the outcomes. But it's not central now today to my, I haven't used it for this.
Question, if you take the legal circles, or the legal philosophers, but I think those also the more general philosophers were also very influential in the history of mentality, I would say.
Yeah, of course that is so, and I don't want to isolate, of course, the legal argument completely. Actually, one of the main arguments I make here is that you can only understand the legal argument if you put it back against the general, let's say, understood theological background that many had been exposed to in their young years at least. Of course, when we go into the 18th century, then of course you have a more secular philosophical tradition arising. But one of the major points I'm making in much of my work is that, of course, we generally, but that we predate the impact of secularization on inter-Christian powers, relations far too much under the aegis of the Enlightenment, and ignore, let's say, the fact that natural law, for a large extent, for many of these authors, even 19th century authors, was sometimes a vehicle to recycle canon law and theological principles back without being denominational, by transcending the difference between Protestants and Catholics. And that's of course a very different story than with Kant here. Going back to my argument here, the connection of a default, going back a little bit into legal war, what in the end is a legal war as opposed to a just war? A just war is an enforcement action of a so-called violated pre-existing right. A legal war ends with the creation of a title for one of the sides, either through victory, either through negotiation. When you dispute a territory in a just war, you say that the territory is yours legally and that it has been violated and that you are enforcing your right. In the perspective of a legal war, it's dispute settlement. It's, like Gentili says, like a civil trial. Two sides have a, let's say, probable claim, a plausible claim under law to a right, and in the absence of clarity about the justice, they have to fight over it and settle it by arms, or settle it at the end of war by a process of arms plus negotiation, and thus create a title through victory or through negotiations. A legal war acts as a judge. A just war acts actually as a bailiff knocking on the door to execute the verdict. That is the distinction. But the one serves as a default solution to the other. And here the space for aggression opens. What people like Grotius, particularly Vattel, is very elaborate on that, but many authors in the end say a legal war is not just a war which is waged by a sovereign which declares it, who declares it. A legal war is a war which is declared under the allegation that you are the just side. Why? Because you only apply the legality of the war to the both sides, regardless who is just and unjust, because you cannot know who is just. In other words, the injustice is not manifest. As long as there is no manifestly unjust side, you treat both sides equally. But if one of the two sides is manifestly unjust, there is no reason to give him the protection of war, because the international community, and then that's the context of which you, is going to be certain who's the unjust side. In the end, you don't have two, but you have 3 or 4 conditions. A war can be just and legal, a war can be unjust and illegal, but a war can also be unjust and illegal because it's manifestly unjust. And it is in this phase that the idea of aggression grows. Let me now take you to this cause célèbre of aggression, not only in the 18th century, but still much in 19th and 20th century historiography, also because it later gets so many reminiscences to the German attack of 1914 or to World War I, which is that in August 1756, the King of Prussia and the Elector of Brandenburg, Frederick the Great of Preußen, invades Saxony, conquers Saxony, and then through Saxony invades the Austrian Bohemian kingdom belonging to his arch enemy, the Queen of Hungary, Maria Theresia of Austria. This is the third time that he attacks the Austrian monarchy by resorting to force, not in a defensive but in an offensive action. By the way, an offensive action is not necessarily unjust if it's in retaliation of a violation of right. He did so in 1740, when he had just taken the throne, and Maria Theresia had done the same by attacking and conquering the Duchy of Silesia, and in the end securing it by the peace treaties that he made. He did it a second time when he attacked Bohemia to secure his possession of Silesia, and also attacked Saxony at the time. And this is his first case on aggression. He's a recidivist aggressor. More than that, he's also known for his untrustworthiness as an ally, because treaties and alliances are not, it's not his forte to adhere to his word, also not to his main ally, historic ally, France. Now, why does he make this bold move in August 1756? Because he knows an alliance had been in the making for 5-6 years between Austria and Russia, the Tsar of Russia. He suspects that the Elector of Saxony, who is also the King of Poland, is involved. And he knows that his traditional ally on the 1st of May 1756 in the Alliance of Versailles, I could have named this paper From Versailles to Versailles, but nobody would know what I was talking about. A few people would know what I was talking about. He knows that France has made a defensive alliance with Austria, which at the very least neutralizes France if Russia, Saxony and Austria would attack him. To forestall the attack, which he knows will not take place anymore in 1756, but will take in 1757, he decides to make a preemptive move himself, by taking out Saxony and taking defensible positions in Bohemia. For Vatel, who at the time is not only a writer but also an active diplomat, he is the representative of the Elector of Saxony in the canton of Bern, not the most exciting, of course, diplomatic posts in Europe, which leaves him a lot of time to write his major treatise on the laws of nations, which he's actually writing at the time, in 56. This actually makes him to make a statement, not in his work, but in his letter he writes to Bern. That's the next slide, about this attack. While for the attack of 1741, actually December 40, January 41, he still claims that the attack on Silesia was legal because Frederick II took the trouble of claiming that it was just because of dynastic rights to the Duchy of Silesia, even if they were so far-fetched that Frederick II himself would write to one of his ministers, "This is the work of an excellent charlatan." But at least, according to Vatel, he took the trouble to claim that he was the just side, causing doubt and making it impossible to see who was the real aggressor or was the still violator of law in this case. But in a letter to Bern that he later wrote in 57, Vatel, it's a much longer letter, has no qualms about saying this is actually unacceptable, because there's only two positions in which you can say a war is just, either because of a violated right, or because a claim you make on a right. But Frederick II does not make a claim against Saxony, against my master. either because you are attacked or about to be attacked by Saxony, and there's no proof for that at all. So it can only be greed. It can only be, in the end, what is also called aggression. Now, Vattel's work is largely translation from the Latin work of Christian Wolff, the German philosopher, but he adds some, let's say, novel pages. And one of the things that he elaborates is actually this context of aggression, this situation where he says that the pretexts of justice are so thin that one of the sides is manifestly unjust, and this triggers, he doesn't call it collective security, but a common concern for security among European states that actually allows them to jointly oppose in an alliance the aggressor and even to punish him. Now, he doesn't insist on punishment because for Vattel this is about security for the future much more than about a moral retribution of any kind. He also lists what the situations are under which a case is manifestly unjust. Well, first, those who don't take the trouble to claim that they are fighting a just war, who are so arrogant that they are like ferocious animals, ferox, enemies of mankind, with a quote to Seneca, of reference here to Seneca. Those people who are so much out of the community of princes that they feel that they don't even have to claim justice. Secondly, notorious warmongers like Frederick II, recidivists who so often resort to force that you cannot believe them anymore. Thirdly, disturbers of the peace. These are those who want to overhaul the balance of power and end the sovereignty and liberty of other states and the system of Europe that guarantees peace and security. And finally, violators of sacred trusts, those who cannot keep their promises, cannot keep their treaties. This can all be aggravated by the fact that these aggressors also show a very great lack of respect for the laws of war, as Frederick II has done according to Vattel when he plundered the electoral palace of Dresden and took away the furniture and the paintings of the electoral princess of Dresden towards Berlin. That seems to be the most important violation of the laws of war in the 18th century. By the way, Frederick II and the princess very politely converse about that. At some point he asks her how she's doing, that now she's in Poland, other territory, and he says, I would be doing better with my furniture if I had it. This is not just theory, this is not just diplomatic reaction, there's also a lot of practical things at play. Frederick II doesn't want to seem to be in violation of the norms that regulate behavior of princes, because it might lead to a declaration of war against them, not by the empress, but by the whole Holy Roman Empire. So by this constellation, this confederation of more than 300 states who don't necessarily have to fight a war with him. And secondly, far more importantly, there's the defensive alliance of Versailles between Vienna and Versailles, between France and Austria, which states that it is defensive, which means that only in case of an unjust attack on Austria, France will have to come to the aid of Austria. Frederick II, who didn't take too much trouble to justify his attack on Silesia in 1740, now takes a lot of trouble to argue basically that he is not the aggressor. That although he's the first to use force, and although he has no claim of a violation of right against Saxony, he has a right to resort to force. He does that by writing himself a manifesto, a very elaborate manifesto that goes through 6 editions, all handwritten by himself, in which from the 4th edition he starts to speak about aggression. His line of argument here is that an offensive attack doesn't mean aggression necessarily, as long as you have a reason to do it. He argues that one of his rights has been violated by Austria and Saxony. That's a trade treaty they didn't 100% respect, but he doesn't use this as a big enough cause for a all-out attack on Saxony and on Austria. He basically argues that his defense, that he's acting defensively in terms of a preventive defense, because he knows that in the next year the coalition of Austria and Russia will attack him. There he is right, and actually the Austrians and the Russians do not argue too much against that. They argue wisely and correctly that Saxony was not involved. And indeed, it wasn't really involved in the plans of attack. It doesn't help him all very much, his pamphlets. His reputation is bad enough to, in the end, see the French King Louis XV convinced that he should join the fray by the Second Alliance of Versailles, which is an offensive alliance treaty, which is not very common as a practice in the 18th century. That actually, you could say, applies Vattel, or rather Vattel has based himself on the treaty, the other way around. Because what you see here is the forming of a broad coalition to which all European powers are invited to punish and stop the aggressor. It says very clearly, which is exceptional, that the other side is the unjust belligerent to the extent that it should be sanctioned for it, not only by paying for all the damages and costs for the war, but also by losing most of its territory, because as a recidivist aggressor it should be deterred for the future, and it made impossible for the future to attack the balance of power again. Without losing more time, I go on into the 19th century. Now, the standard view in the 19th century in international law textbooks is the indifference theory, that international lawyers generally, commonly, frequently, by majority, did not actually, or nuanced, sophisticated, and still ambiguous or dualist. First of all, natural law survives much longer into the writings and into the minds of the practitioners of the 19th century as generally thought. But even by the mid of the 19th and the late 19th century, when it has, let's say, largely disappeared from the textbooks, for instance, and positivism in what form or another is on the rise, well, of course it makes sense. If just war pertains to natural law and legal war to positive law, and you're a positivist who cuts away natural law, then you cut away just war. But what we see is that, largely based on some arguments made by Vattel and Kluber at the beginning of the 19th century, most authors recycle a principled prohibition to resort to force and war back into their positive law by making a distinction, which of course has some naturalist basis, between fundamental inherent rights of states and secondary or non-primary rights, and or non-inherent rights of state. Inherent rights of states are rights which are inherent to being a state, which are existential for being a state, while the other rights are created by the actions of states like customs and treaties. Now, what are the inherent rights of states? Of course, there's many lists of that, but they come down to the right of existence as a sovereign state, so sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, honor or dignity, and security. Basically self-preservation. And most authors literally or implicitly say, through the structure of their work, an attack on a state, the use of force against a state, is a violation of the fundamental right of existence of a state and is thus not allowed, except when you need to do it for your own self-preservation. And through that, the just war doctrine is slipped in back. In the end, it comes down that war is allowed either as a form of dispute settlement, either to defend yourself against an unprovoked or illegal attack, armed attack, giving self-defense a more, let's say, central position in the 19th century than it used to have before. Of course, this means that the distinction between just and legal war collapses, that the distinction between a war about a right in terms of law enforcement or a war about a right in terms of dispute settlement collapses. What is also different, and a relaxation of the restrictions of the just war, is that while under the just war you speak just about the violation of right or the defense against an armed attack, under the aegis of self-preservation, under the aegis of security, the scope of what you can fight for widens. It is not only anymore defense of a right, but it's also defense of vital interests now, which already appeared with Vattel in the 18th century, or the defense of honor, of dignity. And important wars are declared in the 19th century because of a slant of honor. And there's, of course, because we're talking of security, more openness towards the argument of preemption or anticipatory self-defense of any form out of necessity, particularly in the German tradition, by the way, which has more to do with Clausewitz than with anybody else, but it's certainly in the Northern Prussian tradition there. The same story in practice, where we see that just as in the 17th, 18th century, 19th century states take a lot of trouble to argue that they are actually waging what is basically, they argue along the lines of a vulgarized notion of just war and continue to use that language. To end, I then move towards Versailles. I'm not very good at using PowerPoints, but the machine isn't either today, so I feel supported there. Versailles. Aggression in the end comes 3 times, and I'm not talking now about, that's 4 times with the Covenant of the League of Nations, but let's now forget about that. 3 times with relation to making peace to Germany in the whole discussion. Twice brought in by the Allies and once by Germany itself. Twice by the Allies, the winners, the Allied and Associated Powers. Associated refers to the United States. The first context is the demand that has been made by many politicians in France and Britain and in other countries, particularly France and Britain, that particularly the Emperor of Germany would be brought for an international tribunal to be criminally prosecuted for aggression and for the violation of Belgian and Luxembourg neutrality. Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain in November, December, runs on a platform for his re-election, or his, let's say, for the elections at the end of the war, in which this is a very important point. This is the cause for the preliminary conference between the Allies and the United States that starts in January-February 1919 at Paris to establish the Commission on the Responsibility of the War, which is generally staffed with important international lawyers, including, for instance, James Graham Scott of the American Society of International Law, just to name, but also Renaud from France and others from many other countries. The Commission in its report clearly establishes that Germany and its allies is guilty of a violation of treaty of the neutrality of Belgium and Luxembourg, but also of premeditated aggression by escalating the conflict between Serbia and Austria on the murder of the Archduke into a general war which it wanted, which it premeditated, which it planned, and which it had actually decided on, and calls this aggression. But against the resistance of the United States and Japan, they cannot bring that, materialize that into criminal prosecution. The Americans and the Japanese are against that, first because of the diplomatic immunity of a head of state, secondly, which they want to preserve, secondly, because of the principle of non-retroactivity in criminal law, in which they claim aggression was not an imputable crime before, so we cannot make it now after the facts. Now, interestingly, this not only carries the day, but to an extent which was not necessary. It is actually, I think, because of a very violent attack on the American position by a French international lawyer, de la Pradelle, that the Americans hit back, James Brown Scott hits back very hard, because in the end, the American position that William II could not be criminally prosecuted before a real criminal trial could have been made by invoking diplomatic immunity or invoking indeed non-retroactivity in criminal law. But the final report, in which the Americans carry the day, actually goes much further by saying here that the premeditation of a war of aggression suddenly declared on the false pretext is conduct which the public conscience reproves and which history will condemn, but by reason of the purely optional character of the institutions at The Hague for the maintenance of peace, it cannot be considered as an act directly to positive international law, is meant here. And this is a far bigger step that was necessary to prevent a real criminal prosecution. I explained you why, but what does it mean, this purely optional character of the institutions of The Hague? This refers to the first convention of the Peace Conference of The Hague of 1899 on the peaceful settlement of disputes, in which the states of the world were not forced, were not under a legal obligation, but just exhorted to try the peaceful settlement of disputes before they would resort to force. Now, interestingly here, is that here all of a sudden, the Commission for the Responsibility of the War, with all these important international lawyers, reduces the understanding of the normative system that regulates international behavior, which used to be the law of nature and of nations, always used to be a much wider notion of positive law, into enforceable positive law. The definition of Oppenheim, indeed, of 1905-1906, but the minority position among scholars all of a sudden becomes the majority position. And I think largely coincidental out of the discussions that were waged, and because James Brown Scott adhered very strongly to this position. The end results, when the Commission's report is taken to the leaders, to Clemenceau, to Lloyd George and to Wilson, is a triple negotiation in which in the end it results in Article 231 that just says that William II will be arraigned before an international tribunal. Not really a criminal prosecution, but a moral tap on the wrist of some kind in the American reading, something stronger in the British-French reading, but they can go home, of course, with the fact that aggression has been committed and that aggression is absolutely unacceptable and individually imputable, if not prosecutable. That's the first element. The second element is the discussion about reparations. This is also a very intricate discussion. In Britain, France, Belgium and other Western countries or countries from the alliance that won World War II, there was a general feeling that Germany should pay up for the costs and certainly the damages to civilians of the war, the military costs and the civilian damage. Normally in the 19th century, such costs would be covered for the victor by an indemnification, which is a lump sum which is paid by the loser to the winner of the war, not because it was the unjust side or the aggression, but because it lost the war, simply as a kind of cost for losing the war without any claim towards justice or legality. Now for Wilson, the American president, this is absolutely unacceptable. He has said so many times, among others in his famous 14-point speech. Moreover, when the armistice is signed on the 11th of November, this happens after intricate negotiations between the Germans and the Americans and between the Americans and the French and the British, which actually are made under the assumption that two speeches of Wilson, including the 14 points, are the preliminary conditions under which Germany accepts the armistice and will enter into peace negotiations. And under these conditions, there can be no indemnification, there can only be damage resulting from illegal actions. Now the British and the French and the Americans agree that all the costs and damages for the war, which are made in pursuance of the violation of the neutrality of Belgium and Luxembourg, will have to be paid. This is also quite important to the Americans, because the British and the French have been paying for the war for Belgium, which only held on to a tiny part of its territory, and the Americans have lent the money for the British and the French to do that. So there's easy agreement there. There's an extension on the agreement. This is still before the 11th of November, before the armistice. There's an extension of the agreement between the Franco-British and the American negotiators, that this also will extend to all war damage done in the northeastern provinces of France, which have been invaded through Belgium and Luxembourg. But the French and the British want to go further. They also want to have damages or reparation for all the losses suffered on the sea, and they feel that the language of the 14 points, which speaks about the restoration of France, Belgium and Luxembourg, does not extend to physical damage, only to property damage. And for that reason, in the end, they make a reservation in which they say, of course, they can do two things, the French and the British. They can demand reparation for any violation of the laws of war, but that will end, of course, in years and years of negotiation and trials. Or they can make the whole war illegal. They choose to do the second, and they claim in their reservation to the armistice, which they sent to the Germans and the Americans, that they will hold Germany liable for all the civilian damage done as a consequence of the aggression of Germany by its land, sea and air forces. Now the actual important word is not aggression, which only slips in at the very last moment. It was long invasion. It is sea and air force, particularly sea force. And of course invasion by sea forces doesn't make too much sense when you're sinking boats with submarines in the North Sea. So aggression slips in here, let's say almost by accident. The end result is our famous or infamous Article 227, which is the result of a compromise, flipping through my whole PowerPoint and flipping too far through my PowerPoint, which in the end is the first article out of two connected articles. The compromise, which is made this time between Lloyd George and Wilson, who is aided here by the young lawyer John Foster Dulles at the time, is saying, okay, we'll write in the principle that Germany has to pay everything, but then in 228 we'll reduce it to certain costs and damages. But this is in the end, if you read the article, as many international lawyers have done in the 20s and the 30s, actually this is tort law. This is delict. This is Article 3082 of the French Civil Code. There has been a violation of international law. It's not a crime, and that leads to you having to pay for the damages that result from that violation of international law. This is very clearly based on Article 1382, 83 of the French Civil Code. There's no doubt from the travaux préparatoires that this is indeed the case. Yet something strange happens. When in May 1919 the Germans get the result of the Diktat of Versailles, they would say. When at that time they get the treaty, and they know through the press and through some friends the report of the Commission of the Responsibility of the War, they mistakenly believe that Article 227 and the report are connected. They actually read the delict clause as the guilt clause. They actually think that the fact that they are held to pay all the damages because they have committed aggression, also to be based on the Commission of Responsibility of the War report as a criminal imputation, which in the end cannot be prosecuted, but a criminal imputation. And because of this mistake, they mount a huge defense against this moral conviction, against this criminal conviction of aggression, which leads to the Allies to confirm their reading of the treaty in reaction. But it didn't necessarily have to be like that. Actually, I'm not the first to say that. The last point I want to make is that, and that's maybe the biggest proof for my whole claim, that aggression was not a new violation of the normative system that regulates international relation, is that the defense which Germany mounts against this background, against this reading of the draft treaty, to say that it is not the aggressor is almost exactly the same defense that it uses to justify its action in August, September 1914. It was defending itself against an allegation of aggression in 14, and it was defending itself against an allegation in 19, which is partially misread actually, along the same lines of argument with some nuances that actually don't make a difference for my point. How do we then explain the popularity in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s of the indifference thesis? And how do we then explain that international lawyers and historians of international law quickly after Versailles have come to believe that the inexistence of any restrictions on the right to use force was mainstream in the 19th century? Well, it's a difficult question, but two authors have made sense of that quite recently. First, Verdeboot, which are already, who makes a very strong and well-based argument through many readings of sources that there were two lines to restrict force at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. One was through mandatory arbitration, so with a very direct appeal to an instrument of international law, which failed. And one was through collective security, which was never really tried until after World War I. Now, for international lawyers to mount again on the horse of international law to stop war after World War I, it was better to say that international law had not done anything yet before. That is basically her argument. A stronger, or let's say more concrete argument, is the argument made by Isabel Hull, who wrote this book 2 years ago, A Scrap of Paper, about World War I and the role of international law at the inception and during the waging of World War I, in which she claims, she's not the first one to do it, but she makes again a very convincing case, that the Weimar Republic Foreign Ministry, already during the negotiations before it was the Weimar Republic, but then later when it was the Weimar Republic of Germany Ministry of Foreign Affairs, invested a lot of effort, money, credits, also by leading academics, international lawyers and others, in discrediting the peace treaty of Versailles on the basis that it was the application, the retroactive application of a criminal accusation of something which had not been a crime and not been forbidden before, and that this German effort was extremely successful, not only in Germany, but in the wider Anglo-American and French academia of the 1920s and the 1930s, Max Weber being a crucial figure at the beginning of this effort. Actually, he brought together the academics who played a role in that already in February, March 1919, when leaks of the conference started to pour in into Germany, and many others actually played quite a crucial role in that. There was a lot of money, actually, as Hull shows, for German scholars in the 20s, 30s to travel to the United States and Britain to make these kinds of arguments. And later, of course, when many German scholars who were raised on these ideas or actually had invested in these ideas moved for very different reasons towards the Anglo-American world, they brought this wisdom with them. And with that, I think I more than extended my time, and there's some time for questions. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. It was very, I can't really, it's an understatement to say that it was very interesting. So I have 3 questions, but the one is maybe a bigger one, the 2 others are smaller ones in my opinion. Well, the first one is, it was very interesting to learn about this pre-19th century legal theory, so to say, about the distinction between legal war and just war being the older, this more medieval concept, and the legal war would be in something newer one, but they coexisted allegedly. It was my impression. I was reading, I'm not an international lawyer in any way, but I read lots of medieval post-glossators who dealt with issues which we now call international law. And it's my impression that there was still some kind of strong intellectual change in the era of Renaissance. and that the older conception, this they believed in this jus commune, that there is, and like they also used such categories as natural law, used gensum, but they were not secularized. They were very tightened to this idea that there's one quasi-Roman empire which in some ways still legally existent, and the international law is not really different from the positive law of the nations. And their view of the law was kind of the international law was very determinist in a way. For example, everything is predetermined. For example, if a new like if you discover a new island in the sea, you can in advance predetermine who it belongs to, depending on which country it is closer to. So it's not the first come first served, the first occupier who can claim this island, but someone who can prove that this island is closer to your shores. And that they also exposed this, like Spain, for example, Spain and Portugal, since like in the 15th century, after they discovered America, they claimed that the ocean, they could claim the ocean and divide it because of those principles that everything is predetermined. And then there was this new approach exposed by Grotius that no, we have that the law of nature applies in most cases because you find something, you capture it, it is yours. So the world is open in a way. So I wonder whether this difference of approaches, which was obviously there, was ever influential in the decline of their older just war theory and the coming rise of this newer legal war and just war combined theory. So yeah, that's the big question. And maybe I might ask just to others quickly. So it was very interesting to learn for me. It was very interesting to learn for me that Americans were the the American delegation was the ones who objected to Kaiser Wilhelm being prosecuted, because it was my impression that the American leadership, Wilson, was the most inwards, at least, was the most idealistic in terms of, dealing with the war result. And as I remember correctly, it was Wilson who insisted that Kaiser Wilhelm should not be a party to negotiations. He should step down to the more democratic government should be established in Germany. So I wonder why still they insisted on those on this, that he should be persecuted. And the third one is more like maybe a reply, that the reasons why in the most of the 20th century there was such a legend that before World War I there was no that the international law was indifferent to moral and justice arguments. To me it seems quite obvious. It's just it's a widespread intellectual disease of the 20th century, that everything that was before 20th century was just nothing. It was backwards, and it's only so this very left-wing ideology that only in the 20th century true justice in the world was established. Well, I'm Russian, and I can say with us, in our historiography, everything that was before 1917 revolution was pure barbarism. It was the revolution that made the biggest difference in the world's history, something like that. Do you think couldn't it be just this, that those international lawyers were just very left-wing to hold such claims? So thank you.
Well, I'll start with I'll take them in reverse order. I think another element is certainly kind of a theological Whig interpretation of history by Western international lawyers, and particularly a very secularized view.
Yes.
So the problem, of course, with much of the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, that of course, after Austin, natural law being demoted to public morality, and which is particularly very strong in the Anglo-American world of the late 19th, beginning 20th century, as something that actually they also to some extent have to fight against the international lawyers. But there's this view of, I would say, a too early secularization. And you can, of course, only understand the importance of the normative force, which is more than a propaganda force of just war discourse, if you understand that while being natural law, a violation of natural law is generally considered also still a sin that might bring you to hell. And if, of course, you take that away, you want to look at you want to look from the period of the Enlightenment, or even worse, from Westphalia. This idea that Westphalia secularized international relations. No, it stopped making the distinction between Catholicism and Protestants, let's say, fixed legal basis for certain rights and obligations in international relations, but it didn't make Christian Europe any less Christian. It was actually just a denominational, and that actually to some extent brings me back to your first question. There's of course a tremendous change in the context in which just war is written about and even also used in practice, and the time of the post-Closetas in the 14th century, and let's say the end of the 17th century after Grotius. One is of course the gradual monopolization of international relations, war and peace by one player, making it actually a platform or a basis for what becomes public international law as a separate field of law, which in the Middle Ages, as you say, the Roman lawyers, the canon lawyers, wrote about what we now call international law. They didn't, we sometimes say they made analogies from private law to international law. No, they didn't. They applied the same law to individuals making a contract and to princes who happen to be, or individuals who happen to be princes, a treaty. So of course there's this emancipation against the backdrop of the rise of the states, if we can call it already that. There is of course the need to find a common basis for arguing legal discourse with non-Christian, non-Roman people like the American Indians. And there's most of all the need to transcend, and that's very strong in Grotius, who in the end, let's say the thrust of Grotius's life and work is overcoming the intellectual divides or the consequences for the intellectual republic of letters of Europe between Protestants and Catholics. That is in the end restoring harmony and peace in the Christian world. The main thrust of all his work, the main political purpose or political goal of all his work, that of course leads to the secularization of just war by putting it from canon law and theology into natural law. But that doesn't mean that it is still not in canon law. The problem is canon law is not a common language anymore. It's a language of division now. So natural law is the safer thing. Actually what happens, I wrote about it in an article in the Oxford Handbook of International Legal Theory, is that much what Grotius calls natural law would have been canon law theology 200 years before, but of course transferred into a different context with of course the emancipation of public international law, voluntary law of nations, the growing role of contract and consent, and indeed, as you say, with territorial acquisitions, the premeditation is not a very good subject, of course, to unite Europe after Protestantism, to say the least. It becomes a very hot issue and something, of course, that cannot unite anymore because it's one of the bigger contentions between not only Catholics but within the Protestant churches. A debate which is, of course, very crucial to Grotius's life. It cost him his career in the end and his his permanent exile from the Netherlands. The second question, yes, Wilson was against the emperor being part of the peace process. Yes, he wanted the democratization of Germany, but the context of the United States and of Wilson particularly also, his international experience was with the Americas and with the Latin American republics. And the whole idea that a former ruler could be held before an international court of justice where the United States would call the shots to many Latin American republics was not something to fly very high. So Wilson was not only concerned, of course, with Europe, he was considered with the Americas. And that, I think, is the main reason for the American stance for diplomatic immunity, most of all. And for Japan, well, a newly, let's say, modernized, westernized, sovereign state, the same was certainly true. Yes, Mark?
So just, sorry, we're right at the end and I have to run too, but so what, maybe I'm wrong, but from what I understood from the Tokyo trials that took place after 1945, after the Second World War, there was a shift in US position. So it seemed that the Australians and the US and so on were arguing that there was no crime of aggression in existence at the time, and therefore that couldn't be a charge against the Japanese High Command. Am I correct in thinking that? And if so, why did the US shift its position?
It shifted their position. I cannot really say you why now, off the top of my head. Sorry.
Okay. So the Americans are pushing hard for that it was a crime of aggression, and since the Kellogg-Briand, but was that the shift or?
Yes, that is certainly. Yeah, that's a good point, but that's not really the same of aggression. Well, it's more complicated. I would say than that. It's not just about use of force, it's of course all the whole criminal prosecution argument.
Okay.
There's still a lot of concern about what I just said about
Yeah.
the Americas, but far less on this subject. It's much more on the subject of self-defense, because the Americans for a very long time resist the inclusion of a reference to self-defense in the United Nations Charter, because that would lead to rehearsing the question or going back to the question what aggression is. This also explains why you find armed attack in Article 51 and not aggression. But this has everything to do with the Pact of Rio and with the Organization of American States, which is a defensive agreement in budding at the time. And they want to preserve some way self-defense without including aggression in terms of use of force law. Yeah. Vandenberg's papers are actually very illuminating there, but not so much in the discussion on criminal law. I can't answer that, why. Any other questions? Good?
Well, yeah, I'm a layman in this respect. I wonder what's the functional relationship or the difference between, on the one hand, these international lawyers and diplomats?
That's of course a very difficult question, and a lot of prosopographic research should be done about who, let's say, the actual drafters, negotiators, drafters were of treaties. I would say there's a certain evolution from the late Middle Ages towards the 20th century when the direct role of lawyers generally lessens. Then, of course, to be very important between the 1870s and the 1940s, then it's very important. But the general line, of course, medieval treaties were generally drafted and written by notaries, so who had an exposition to legal education in canon and or Roman law. A typical peace negotiation delegation in the 16th, 17th, 18th century would be a nobleman, a clergyman, a bishop, often of course with a degree in theology and or canon law, and a lawyer, or legal advisor at least, depending on the country, not necessarily university trained, but somebody with quite some experience and some education in some form or another, or training in the law. And then you see, of course, that the more sophisticated articles would be written by the lawyers. Declarations and manifestos of war would normally be written through the royal bureaucracy, and that would always involve the role of lawyers until in a leading capacity, not just, you know, as the secretaries or the second or third tier, but in a legal capacity. In the 19th century, when international law is professionalized, they become a little bit more the outsider. I would even say in the high days of international law, the end of the 19th, beginning of 20th century here, they're more the expert outsider. But then, of course, in multilateral settings, in commissions and conferences like The Hague, when many people are needed, then, of course, is the moment for international lawyers to take the floor and to start. Like in some commissions and The Hague peace conferences, and of course when it's about real legal issues like arbitration, like the setup of the Permanent Court of International Justice, or like a commission on the responsibility of the war, then you see the lawyers come forward. But when we're talking about the reparations committees, it's the finance people. It's the ministers of finance and the people from the Ministry of Finance that rather come to the fore. That also explains why it's possible that these two commissions can work at Versailles, let's say, in almost splendid isolation. And when even the leaders, of course, who do not have much time to think about it, never connect the two texts. We've not really proved that they connect the two texts to one another. It's the Germans who connect the text to one another.
Were there then, in the beginning of the 20th century, already chairs for international law in academia?
Yeah, well, the first chairs that are made in universities and sometimes law schools that are not about Roman law are the chairs in Jus Naturae at Gentium in late 17th, 18th century. Germany, Scotland, Edinburgh, 1707. And then at the end of the end of the 19th century, the first one is that by in Italy, in Torino. That's the 1850s, I think, 1859, Mancini. Then you have Oxford, Cambridge, other universities. The United States actually starts to teach international law at some leading law schools in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I think the first chair is 1891. But yes, and that's of course still a big step because there are not many chairs at the time.
And in the Netherlands, do you know?
I couldn't say by heart, but I don't think so in the 19th century. Could be mistaken. Any other questions? There are people who teach international law, of course, and work on international law, but generally from a different background. Okay, thanks for your presence and attention.